The Seahorses by William Hope Hodgson, performed by Kristin Holland.
And we's under the sea, boys, where the wild horses go. Horses with tails as big as old whales, all jigging around in a row. And when you says whoa, them divvils does go.
How was it you catched my one, Grandfer?
Asked Nebby, as he had asked the same question any time during the past week, whenever his burly, grey Guernseyed grandfather crooned out the old ballad of the Seahorses, which, however, he never carried past the portion given above.
Like as he was a bit weak, Nebby boy, and I gave him a smart clip with the axe, 'fore he could bolt off, explained his grandfather, lying with inimitable gravity and relish. Nebby dismounted from his curious-looking go-horse by the simple means of dragging it forward from between his legs. He examined its peculiar, unicorn-like head, and at last put his finger on a bruised indentation in the black paint that covered the nose.
Is that where you welted him, Grandfer?
He asked seriously.
Aye,
said his grandfer Zacky, taking the strangely shaped go-horse and examining the contused paint.
I sure hit him a tumble welt.
Are he dead, Grandfer?
Asked the boy.
Well,
said the burly old man, feeling the go-horse all over with an enormous finger and thumb.
Betwixt and between, like.
He opened the cleverly hinged mouth and looked at the bone teeth with which he had fitted it, and then squinted earnestly with one eye down the red-painted throat.
Aye, he repeated, betwixt and between, Nebby. Don't you never let him go to water, boy, for it may become alive again, and you'll lose him, sure.
Perhaps old Diver Zacky, as he was called in the little sea village, was thinking that water would prove unhealthy to the glue with which he had fixed on the big bonito's tail, at what he termed the starn end of the curious-looking beast. He had cut the whole thing out of a nice 4-foot by 10-inch piece of soft, knotless yellow pine, and to the rear he'd attached thwartship the aforementioned bonito's tail. For the thing was no ordinary horse, as you may think, but a genuine, as Zacky described it, sea-horse, which he had brought up from the sea bottom for his small grandson whilst following his occupation as diver. The animal had taken him many a long hour to carve, and had been made during his spellows between dives aboard the diving barge. The creature itself was a combined production of his own extremely fertile fancy, plus his small grandson's faith. For Zacky had manufactured unending and peculiar stories of what he saw daily at the bottom of the sea, and during many a winter's evening Nebby had cut boats around the big stove, whilst the old man smoked and yarned the impossible yarns that were so marvellously real and possible to the boy. And of all the tales that the old diver told in his whimsical fashion, there was none that so stirred Nebby's feelings as the one about the sea-horses. At first it had been a scrappy and a fragmentary yarn, suggested as like as not by the old ballad which Zacky so often hummed, half unconsciously. But Nebby's constant questionings had provided so many suggestions for fresh additions that at last it took nearly the whole of a long evening for the tale of the Seahorses to be told properly, from where the first horse was seen by Zacky, eating sea grass as natural as you like, to where Zacky had seen little Martha Tolletsby riding one like a real cowpuncher. And from that tremendous effort of imagination, the horse yarn had speedily grown to include every child that wended the long road out of the village.
Shall I go riding them sea-horses, Grandfer, when I dies?
Nebby had asked earnestly.
Aye, Grandfer Zaki had replied, absently puffing at his corn cob. Aye, like's not, Nebby, like as not.
Maybe I'll die middlin' soon, Grandfer,
Nebby had suggested longingly.
There's plenty little boys dies 'fore they gets growed up.
Husht, boy, husht, Grandfer had said, waking suddenly to what the child was saying. Later, when Nebby had many times betrayed his exceeding high requirement of death, that he might ride the seahorses all around his grandfer at work on the sea bottom, old Zaki had suddenly evolved a less drastic solution to the difficulty.
I'll catch you one, Nebby, sure, he said, and you can ride it round the kitchen.
The suggestion pleased Nebby enormously and practically nullified his impatience regarding the date of his death, which was to give him the freedom of the sea and all the seahorses therein. For a long month, old Zaki was met each evening by a small and earnest boy, desirous of learning whether he had catched one that day or not. Meanwhile, Zaki had been dealing honestly with that 4-foot by 10-inch piece of yellow pine already described. He had carved out his notion of what might be supposed to constitute a veritable seahorse, aided in his invention by Nebby's illuminating questions as to whether seahorses had tails like a real horse or like real fishes. Did they wear horseshoes? Did they bite? These were 3 points upon which Nebby's curiosity was definite, and the results were definite enough in the finished work, for Grandfer supplied the peculiar creature with real bone teeth and a workable jaw, 2 squat but prodigious legs near what he termed the bows, whilst at the starn he affixed the bonito tail, which has already had mention, setting it the way Dame Nature sets it on the bonito, that is, thwartships, so that its 2 flukes touched the ground when the horse was in position, and thus steadied it admirably, with this hint taken from the workmanship of the great carpenter. There came a day when the horse was finished, and the last coat of paint had dried smooth and hard. That evening, when Nebby came running to meet Zaki, he was aware of his grandfather's voice in the dusk shouting,
"Whoa, mare! Whoa, mare!"
followed immediately by the cracking of a whip. Nebby shrilled out a call and raced on, mad with excitement, towards the noise. He knew instantly that at last Grandfer had managed to catch one of the wily seahorses. Presumably the creature was somewhat intractable, for when Nebby arrived he found the burly form of Grandfer straining back tremendously upon stout reins, which Nebby saw vaguely in the dusk were attached to a squat black monster.
"Whoa, mare!"
roared Grandfer, and lashed the air furiously with his whip. Nebby shrieked delight and ran round and round whilst Grandfer struggled with the animal. "Hi, hi, hi!" shouted Nebby, dancing from foot to foot. "You've catched him, Grandfer! You've catched him, Grandfer!"
"Aye,"
said Grandfer, whose struggles with the creature must have been prodigious, for he appeared to pant.
"She'll go quiet now, boy. Take a hold."
And he handed the reins and the whip over to the excited but half-fearful Nebby.
"Put your hand on her, Neb,"
said old Zaki.
"That'll quiet her."
Nebby did so, a little nervously, and drew away in a moment.
"She's all wet as wet,"
he cried out.
"Aye,"
said Grandfer, striving to hide the delight in his voice.
"She am straight up from the water, boy."
This was quite true. It was the final artistic effort of Grandfer's imagination. He had dipped the horse overside just before leaving the diving barge. He took his towel from his pocket and wiped the horse down, hissing as he did so.
"Now, boy," he said, "welter good and make her take you home."
Nebby straddled the go-horse, made an ineffectual effort to crack the whip, shouted, "Gee up! Gee up!" and was off, 2 small, lean, bare legs twinkling away into the darkness at a tremendous rate, accompanied by shrill and recurrent gee-ups. Grandfer Zaki stood in the dusk, laughing happily, and pulled out his pipe. He filled it slowly, and as he applied the light, he heard the galloping of the horse returning. Nebby dashed up and circled his grandfer in splendid fashion, singing in a rather breathless voice.
And we under the sea, boys, where the wild horses go. Horses with tails as big as a whale, so chicken around in a row. And when you says, whoa, them divvils does go.
And away he went again at a gallop. This had happened a week earlier, and now we have Nebby questioning Grandfer Zaki as to whether the seahorse is really alive or dead.
Should think they has seahorses in heaven, Grandfer,
said Nebby thoughtfully, as he once more straddled the seahorse. Sure, said Grandfer Zaki.
Is Martha Tullett's little bike gone to heaven?
Asked Nebby. Sure, said Grandfer again as he sucked at his pipe. Nebby was silent a good while, thinking. It was obvious that he confused heaven with the domain of the seahorses, for had not Grandfer himself seen Martha Tullett's little boy riding one of the seahorses? Nebby had told Mrs. Tullett about it, but she had only thrown her apron over her head and cried, until at last Nebby had stolen away, feeling rather dumpy.
Has you ever seen any angels with wings on the seahorses, Grandfer?
Nebby asked presently, determined to have further information with which to assure his ideas. Aye, said Grandfer Zaki. Shoals of 'em, boy. Nebby was greatly pleased.
Could they ride some, Grandfer?
He questioned. Sure, said old Zaki, reaching for his pouch.
As good as me?
Asked Nebby anxiously. Middlin' near, boy, said Grandfer Zaki. Why, Neb, he continued, waking up with a sudden relish to the full possibilities of the question, that some of them lady angels as could do back somersaults and never take a throw, boy. It is to be feared that Grandfer Zaki's conception of a lady angel had been formed during odd visits to the circus. But Nebby was duly impressed, and bumped his head badly the same day, trying to achieve the rudiments of a back somersault. Part 2. Some evenings later, Nebby came running to meet old Zaki with an eager question.
Has you seen Jade Melly's little girl riding the horses, Grandfer?
He asked earnestly. Aye, said Grandfer, then realizing suddenly what the question portended. What's wrong with Miss Melly's wee girl? He queried.
Ted,
said Nebby calmly.
Mrs. Kay says it's the fever come to the village again, Grandfer.
Nebby's voice was cheerful, for the fever had visited the village some months before, and Grandfer Zaki had taken Nebby to live on the barge, away from the danger of infection. Nebby had enjoyed it all enormously, and had often prayed God since to send another fever, with its attendant possibilities of life, again aboard the diving barge.
Shall we live in the barge, Grandfer?
He asked as he swung along with the old man. Maybe, said old Zaki, absently, in a somewhat troubled voice. Grandfer left Nebby in the kitchen and went on up to the village to make inquiries. The result was that he packed Nebby's clothes and toys into a well-washed sugar bag, and the next day took the boy down to the barge to live. But whereas Grandfer walked, carrying the sack of gear, Nebby rode all the way, most of it at an amazing gallop. He even rode daringly down the narrow railless gangplank. It is true that Grandfer Zaki took care to keep close behind, in as unobtrusive a fashion as possible, but of this, or the need of such watchfulness, Nebby was most satisfactorily ignorant. He was welcomed in the heartiest fashion by Ned, the pump man, and Binny, who attended to the air pipe and lifeline when Grandfer Zaki was down below. Part 3. Life upon the diving barge was a very happy time for Nebby. It was a happy time also for Grandfer Zaki and his 2 men, for the child playing constantly in their midst brought back to them an adumbration of their youth. There was only one point upon which there arose any trouble, and that was Nebby's forgetfulness in riding across the air tube when he was exercising his seahorse. Ned the pump man had spoken very emphatically to Nebby on this point, and Nebby had promised to remember, but, as usual, soon forgot. They had taken the barge outside the bar and anchored her over the buoy that marked Grandfer's submarine operations. The day was gloriously fine, and so long as the weather remained fixed, they meant to keep the barge out there, merely sending the little punt ashore for provisions. To Nebby it was all just splendid. When he was not riding his seahorse, he was talking to the men, or waiting at the gangway eagerly for Grandfer's great copper headpiece to come up out of the water, as the air tube and lifeline were slowly drawn aboard. Or else his shrill young voice was sure to be heard as he leant over the rail and peered into the depths below, singing,
And we under the sea boys where the wild horses go, horses with tails as big as old whales or chicken around in a row, and when you says whoa, them dimples does go.
Possibly he considered it as some kind of charm with which to call the seahorses up to view. Each time the boat went ashore, it brought sad news, that first this and then that one had gone the long road. But it was chiefly the children that interested Nebby. Each time that his grandfer came up out of the depths, Nebby would dance round him impatiently until the big helmet was unscrewed. Then would come his inevitable, eager question. Had grandfer seen Carrie Andrews' little gel, or grandfer seen Marty's little boy riding the seahorses? And so on. Sure, grandfer would reply, though several times it was his first intimation that the child mentioned had died, the news having reached the barge through some passing boat, whilst he was on the sea bottom. Part 4.
"Look you, Nebby,"
shouted Ned the pump man angrily.
"I'll sure break that horse of yours up for kindling next time you go stepping on that air pipe."
It was all too true. Nebby had forgotten and done it again, but whereas generally he took Ned's remonstrances in good part, and promised better things, he stood now, looking with angry defiance at the man. The suggestion that his seahorse was made of wood bred in him a tempest of bitterness. Never for one moment to himself had he allowed so horrible a thought to enter his own head. Not even when, in a desperate charge, he had knocked a chip off the nose of the seahorse and betrayed the merciless wood below. He had simply refused to look particularly at the place, his fresh child's imagination allowing him presently to grow assured again that all was well, that he truly rode a genuine seahorse. In his earnestness of determined make-believe, he had even avoided showing Grandfer Zaki the place, and asking him to mend it, much as he wanted it mended. Grandfer always mended his toys for him, but this could not be mended. It was a real seahorse, not a toy. Nebby resolutely averted his thoughts from the possibility of any other belief, though it is likely that such mental processes were more subconscious than conscious. And now Ned had said the deadly thing, practically in so many naked words. Nebby trembled with anger and a furious mortification of his pride of seahorse ownership. He looked round swiftly for the surest way to avenge the brutish insult, and saw the air pipe, the thing around which the bother had been made. Yes, that would make Ned angry. Nebby turned his strange steed and charged straight away back at the air pipe. There, with an angry and malicious deliberateness, he halted and made the big front hooves of his extraordinary monster stamp upon the air pipe. "You young devil!" roared Ned, scarcely able to believe the thing he saw. "You young devil!" Nebby continued to stamp the big hoofs upon the pipe, glaring with fierce, defiant blue eyes at Ned. Whereupon Ned's patience arose and departed, and Ned himself arrived bodily, in haste, and with considerable vigour. He gave one kick, and the seahorse went flying across the deck and crashed into the low bulwarks. Nebby screamed, but it was far more a scream of tremendous anger than fear. "I'll heave the blamed thing over the side," said Ned, and ran to complete his dreadful sacrilege. The following instant something clasped his right leg, and small, distinctly sharp teeth bit his bare shin below the uprolled trousers. Ned yelled and sat rapidly and luridly upon the deck in a fashion calculated to shock his system in every sense of the word. Nebby had loosed from him the instant his bite had taken effect, and now he was nursing and examining the black monster of his dreams and waking moments. He knelt there near the bulwarks, looking with burning eyes of anger and enormous distress at the effects of Ned's great kick, for Ned wore his bluchers on his bare feet. Ned himself still endured a sitting conjunction with the deck. He had not yet finished expressing himself. Not that Nebby was in the least interested. Anger and distress had built a wall of fierce indifference about his heart. He desired chiefly Ned's death. If Ned himself had been less noisy, he would have heard Binny even earlier than he did, for that sane man had jumped to the air pump, luckily for Grandfer Zaki, and was now, as he worked, emptying his soul of most of its contents upon the derelict Ned. As it was, Ned's memory and ears did duty together, and he remembered that he had committed the last crime in the pump man's calendar. He had left the pump whilst his diver was still below water. Powder ignited in quite a considerable quantity beneath him could scarcely have moved Ned more speedily. He gave out one yell and leaped for the pump. At the same instant he discovered that Binny was there, and his gasp of relief was as vehement as prayer. He remembered his leg and concluded his journey to the pump with a limp. Here, with one hand he pumped, whilst with the other he investigated Nebby's teeth marks. He found that the skin was barely broken, but it was his temper that most needed mending. And, of course, it had been very naughty of Nebby to attempt such a familiarity. Binny was drawing in the lifeline and air pipe, for Grandfer Zaki was ascending the long rope ladder that led up from the sea bottom, to learn what had caused the unprecedented interruption of his air supply. It was a very angry Grandfer who presently, having heard a fair representation of the facts, applied a wet but horny hand to Nebby's anatomy in a vigorous and decided manner. Yet Nebby neither cried nor spoke. He merely clung on tightly to the seahorse, and Grandfer whacked on. At last Grandfer grew surprised at the continued absence of remonstrance on Nebby's part, and turned that young man the other end about, to discover the wherefore of so determined a silence. Nebby's face was very white, and tears seemed perilously near, yet even the nearness of these did not in any way detract from the expression of unutterable defiance that looked out at Grandfer and all the world from his face. Grandfer regarded him a few moments with an earnest attention and doubt, and decided to cease whipping that atom of blue-eyed stubbornness. He looked at the seahorse that Nebby clutched so tightly in his silence, and perceived the way to make Nebby climb down. Nebby must go and beg Ned's pardon for trying to eat him. Granfer smothered a chuckle, or else the seahorse would be taken away. Nebby's face, however, showed no change, unless it was that the blue eyes shone with a fiercer defiance, which dried out of them that suspicion of tears. Granfer pondered over him, and had a fresh idea. He would take the seahorse back again to the bottom of the sea, and it would then come alive once more and swim away, and Nebby would never see it again, if Nebby did not go at once to Ned and beg Ned's pardon that very minute. Granfer was prodigiously stern. There came perhaps the tiniest flash of fright into the blue eyes, but it was blurred with unbelief. And anyway, it had no power at that stage of Nebby's temper to budge him from his throne of enormous anger. He decided, with that fierce courage of the burner of boats, that if Granfer did truly do such a dreadful thing, he, Nebby, would kneel down proper and pray God to kill Ned. An added relish of vengeance came to his child's mind. He would kneel down in front of Ned. He would pray to God out loud. Ned should thus learn beforehand that he was doomed. In that moment of inspired intention, Nebby became trebly fixed into his aura of implacable anger. He voiced his added grimness of heart in the most tremendous words possible.
"It's wood,"
said Nebby, glaring at Granfer in a kind of fierce, sick, horrible triumph.
"It can't come back alive again."
Then he burst into tears at this dreadful act of disillusionment, and wrenching himself free from Granfer's gently detaining hand, he dashed away aft and down the scuttle into the cuddy, where for an hour he hid himself under a bunk and refused in dreary silence any suggestion of dinner. After dinner, however, he emerged, tear-stained but unbroken. He had brought the seahorse below with him, and now, as the three men watched him unobtrusively from their seats around the little cuddy table, it was plain to them that Nebby had some definite object in view, which he was attempting to mask under an attitude of superb but ineffectual casualness.
"Bye," said Granfer Zaki, in a very stern voice. "Come you and beg Ned's pardon, or I'll sure take the seahorse down with me, and you'll never see him no more, and I'll never catch you another, Nebby." Nebby's reply was an attempt to dash for the scuttle ladder, but Granfer reached out a long arm that might have been described as possessing the radius of the small cuddy. As a result, Nebby was put with his face in a corner, whilst Granfer Zaki laid the seahorse across his knee and stroked it meditatively as he smoked a restful after-dinner pipe. Presently he knocked out his pipe, and reaching round, brought Nebby to stand at his knee. "Nebby, boy," he said in his grave, kindly fashion, "go you and beg Ned's pardon, and you shall have this right back to play with." But Nebby had not been given time yet to ease himself clear of the cloud of his indignation, and even as he stood there by Granfer, he could see the great bruise in the paint where Ned's blucher had taken effect, and the broken fluke of the tail that had been smashed when the poor seahorse brought up so violently against the low bulwarks of the barge.
"Ned's a wicked pig man,"
said Nebby, with a fresh intensity of anger against the pump hand. "Hush, boy," said Granfer, with real sternness. "You've had fair chance to come round, and you've not took it. And now I'll read you a lesson as you'll sure mind." He stood up and put the seahorse under his arm. Then, with one hand on Nebby's shoulder, he went to the ladder. And so, in a minute, they were all on the deck of the barge. Presently, Grandfer was once more transformed from a genial and burly giant into an India rubber-covered and dome-ended monster. Then, with a slowness and solemnity befitting so terrible an execution of justice, Grandfer made a fathom or so of Spaniard fast about the seahorse's neck, whilst Nebby looked on, white-faced. When this was accomplished, Grandfer stood up and marched with ponderous steps to the side, the seahorse under his arm. He began to go slowly down the wooden rungs of the rope ladder, and presently there were only his shoulders and copper headpiece visible. Nebby stared down in an anguish. He could see the seahorse vaguely. It seemed to waggle in the crook of Grandfer's arm. It was surely about to swim away. Then Grandfer's shoulders and finally his great copper head disappeared from sight, and there was soon only the slight working of the ladder and the paying out of the air pipe and lifeline to tell that there was anyone down there in all that greyness of the water dusk. For Grandfer had often explained to Nebby that it was always evening at the sea bottom. Nebby sobbed once or twice in a dry, horrid way in his throat. Then, for quite half an hour, he lay flat on his stomach in the gangway, silent and watchful, staring down into the water. Several times he felt quite sure he saw something swimming with a queer, waggling movement a little under the water, and presently he started to sing in a low voice.
And we's under the sea, place where the wild horses go. Horses with tails as big as old whales, all jiggin around in a row. And when he says whoa, them devils does go.
But it seemed to have no power to charm the seahorse up to the surface, and he fell silent, after singing it through maybe a dozen times. He was waiting for Grandfer. He had a vague hope which grew that Grandfer had meant to tie it up with the Spaniard so that it could not swim away, and perhaps Grandfer would bring it up with him when he came. Nebby felt that he would really beg Ned's pardon if only Grandfer brought the seahorse up with him again. A little later there came the signal that Grandfer was about to ascend, and Nebby literally trembled with excitement as the lifeline and air pipe came in slowly, hand over hand. He saw the big dome of the helmet come vaguely into view, with the line of the air pipe leading down at the usual funny angle, right into the top of the dome. It was an old type of helmet. Then the helmet broke the water, and Nebby could not see anything because the rimples on the water stopped him seeing. Grandfer's big shoulders came into view, and then sufficient of him for Nebby to see that the seahorse was truly not with him. Nebby whitened. Grandfer had really let the seahorse go. As a matter of fact, Grandfer Zaki had tethered the seahorse to some tough marine weed rootlets at the sea bottom, so as to prevent it floating traitorously to the surface. But to Nebby, it was plain only that the seahorse had truly come alive and swum away. Grandfer stepped onto the deck, and Binny eased off the great helmet, whilst Ned ceased his last slow revolution of the pump handle. It was at this moment that Nebby faced round on Neb, with a white, set little face, in which his blue eyes literally burned. Ned was surely doomed in that instant. And then, even in the moment of his intention, Nebby heard Grandfer say to Binny, "Aye, I'm moored with the Spaniard safe enough." Nebby's anger lost its deadliness abruptly, under the sudden sweet chemistry of hope. He oscillated an instant between a new vague thought and his swiftly lessening requirement of vengeance. The new vague thought became less vague, and he swayed the more toward it,
and so, in a moment, had rid himself of his dignity and run across to Grandfer Zacky.
"Has it come to life, Grandfer?"
he asked breathlessly, with the infinite eagerness and expectancy of a child. "Aye," said Grandfer Zacky with apparent sternness. "You've sure lost it now, boy. 'Tis swimming and swimming round and round all the time." Nebby's eyes shone with sudden splendour as the new idea took now a most definite form in his young brain. Grandfer, looking at him with eyes of tremendous sternness, was quite nonplussed at the harmless effect of this expectedly annihilative news concerning the final and obvious lostness of the seahorse. Yet Nebby said never a word to give Grandfer an inkling of the stupendous plan that was settling fast in his daring child's mind. He opened his mouth once or twice upon a further question, then relapsed into the safety of silence again, as though instinctively realizing that he might ask something that would make Grandfer suspicious. Presently, Nebby had stolen away once more to the gangway, and there, lying on his stomach, he began again to look down into the sea. His anger now was almost entirely submerged in the great, glorious new idea that filled him with such tremendous exultation that he could scarcely lie quiet or cease from singing aloud at the top of his voice. A few moments earlier he had meant to kneel down proper and pray God out loud for Ned to be killed quickly and painfully. But now all was changed, though in an indifferent sort of way. In his healthily savage child's mind, he did not forgive Ned. Ned's sin had of course been unforgivable, presumably for ever and ever and ever. Certainly until tomorrow. Meanwhile, Nebby never so much as thought of him, except it might be as one whose bewilderment should presently be the last lustre of the glory of his, Nebby's, proposed achievement. Not that Nebby thought it all out like this, into separate ideas, but it was all there in that young and surging head, in what I might term a chaos of determination, buoying up, as it might be a lonesome craft, one clear, vigorous idea. Grandfer Zacky went down twice more before evening, and each time that he returned, Nebby questioned him earnestly as to the doings of the seahorse, and each time Grandfer told the same tale, in accents of would-be sternness, that the seahorse was just swimming round and round, and maybe you wish now you'd begged Ned's pardon when you was bit. But in his heart, Grandfer decided that the seahorse might be safely recaught on the morrow. Part 5. That night, when the three men were asleep in the little cuddy, Nebby's small figure slipped noiselessly out of the bunk that lay below Grandfer Zacky's. He flitted silently to the ladder and stole up into the warm night, his shirt, a quaint cut-down of Grandfer's, softly flicking his lean, bare legs as he moved through the darkness along the barge's decks. Nebby came to a stop where Grandfer's diving suit was hung up carefully on the frame, but this was not what Nebby wanted. He stooped to the bottom of the frame and pulled up the small hatch of a square locker, where reposed the big domed copper helmet, glimmering dully in the vague starlight. Nebby reached into the locker and lugged the helmet out bodily, hauling it with both hands upon the air pipe. He carried it across clumsily to the gangway, the air pipe unreeling off the winch with each step that he took. He found the helmet too clumsy and rotund to lift easily onto his own curly head, and so, after an attempt or two, evolved the method of turning the helmet upon its side and then kneeling down and thrusting his head into it, after which, with a prodigious effort, he rose victoriously to his knees and began to fumble himself backwards over the edge of the gangway onto the wooden rungs of Grandfer's rope ladder, which had not been hauled up. He managed a firm foothold with his left foot, and then with his right, and so began to descend, slowly and painfully, the great helmet rocking clumsily on his small shoulders. His right foot touched the water at the fourth rung, and he paused, bringing the other foot down beside the first. The water was pleasantly warm, and Nebby hesitated only a very little while ere he ventured the next step. Then he stopped again and tried to look down into the water. The action swayed the big helmet backwards, so that inside of it Nebby's delightfully impudent little nose received a bang that made his determined blue eyes water. He loosed his left hand from the ladder, holding on with his right, and tried to push the clumsy helmet forward again into place. He was, as you will understand, up to his knees in the water, and the rung on which he perched was slippery with that peculiar slipperiness that wood and water together know so well how to breed. One of Nebby's bare feet slipped, and immediately the other. The great helmet gave a prodigious wobble and completed the danger, for the sudden strain wrenched his grip from the rope between the rungs. There was a muffled little cry inside the helmet, and Nebby swung a small, desperate hand through the darkness towards the ladder. But it was too late. He was falling. There was a splash, not a very big splash for so big a boy's heart and courage, and no one heard it, or the little bubbling squeak that came out of the depths of the big copper helmet. And then, in a moment, there was only the vaguely disturbed surface of the water, and the air pipe was running out smoothly and swiftly off the drum. Part 6. It was in the strange early morning light, when the lemon and gold of light of dawn was in the grey east, that Granfer discovered the thing which had happened. With the wakefulness that is so often an asset of healthy age, he had turned out in the early hours to fill his pipe, and had discovered that Nebby's bunk was empty. He went swiftly up the small ladder. On the deck, the out-trailed air pipe whispered its tale in silence, and Granfer rushed to it, shouting in a dreadful voice for Binny and Ned, who came running up sleepily in their heavy flannel drawers. They hauled in the air pipe, swiftly but carefully, but when the great dome of the helmet came up to them, there was no Nebby. Only tangled from the thread of one of the old-fashioned thumbscrews, they found several golden curly strands of Nebby's hair. Granfer, his great muscular hands trembling, began to get into his rubber suit, the two men helping him, wordless. Within 150 seconds, he was dwindling away down under the quiet sea that spread, all grey and lemon-hued and utterly calm in the dawn. Ned was turning the pump handle and wiping his eyes undisguisedly from time to time with the back of one hairy, disengaged hand. Binny, who was of a sterner type, though no less warm-hearted, was grimly silent, giving his whole attention to the air pipe and the lifeline, his hand delicate upon the line, awaiting the signal. He could tell from the feel and the coming up and going out of the pipe and the line that Granfer Zaki was casting round and round in ever-largening circles upon the sea bottom. All that day Granfer courted the sea bottom, staying down so long each time that at last Binny and Ned were forced to remonstrate, but the old man turned on them and snarled in a kind of speechless anger and agony that forced them to be silent and let him go his own gait. For 3 days Granfer continued his search, the sea remaining calm, but found nothing. On the fourth day, Grandfer Zacky was forced to take the barge in over the bar, for the wind breezed up hard out of the north, and blew for a dreary and savage fortnight, each day of which found Grandfer with Binny and Ned searching the shore for the giving up of the sea. But the sea had one of its secret moods, and gave up nothing. At the end of the fortnight of heavy weather it fell calm, and they took the barge out again to start once more their daily work. There was little use now in searching further for the boy. The barge was moored again over the old spot, and Grandfer descended. And the first thing he saw in the grey half-light of the water was the seahorse, still moored securely by the length of Spaniard to the rootlets of heavy weed at the sea bottom. The sight of the creature gave old Zacky a dreadful feeling. It was at once so familiar of Nebby as to give him the sensation and unreasoning impression that the boy must be surely close at hand, and yet, at the same time, the grotesque, inanimate creature was the visible incarnation of the dire cause of the unspeakable loneliness and desolation that now possessed his old heart so utterly. He glared at it through the thick glass of his helmet and half raised his axe to strike at it. Then, with a sudden revulsion, he reached out and pulled the silent go-horse to him and hugged it madly, as if, indeed, it were the boy himself. Presently old Grandfer Zacky grew calmer and turned to his work, yet 100 times he would find himself staring round in the watery twilight towards it, staring eagerly and unreasoningly, and actually listening inside his helmet for sounds that the eternal silence of the sea might never bring through its dumb waters, that are barriers of silence about the lonesome diver in the strange underworld of the waters. And then, realizing freshly that there was no longer one who might make the so craved-for sounds, Grandfer would turn again, grey-souled and lonely, to his work. Yet, in a while, he would be staring and listening once more. In the course of days, old Zacky grew calmer and more resigned, yet he kept the motionless seahorse tethered in the quiet twilight of the water to the weed rootlets at the sea bottom, and more he grew to staring round at it, and less did it seem a futile or an unreasonable thing to do. In weeks the habit grew to such an extent that he had ceased to be aware of it. He prolonged his hours under water, out of all reason so far as his health was concerned, and turned queerly dour when Ned and Binny remonstrated with him, warning him not to stay down so long, or he would certainly have to pay the usual penalty. Only once did Grandfer say a word in explanation, and then it was obviously an unintentional remark, jerked out of him by the intensity of his feelings.
"Like as I feel him nigh me when I'm below,"
he had muttered in a half-coherent fashion, and the two men understood, for it was just what they had vaguely supposed. They had no reply to make, and the matter dropped. Generally now, on descending each morning, Grandfer would stop near the seahorse and look it over. Once he discovered that the bonito tail had come unglued, but this he remedied neatly by lashing it firmly into position with a length of roping twine. Sometimes he would pat the head of the horse with one great hand and mutter a quiet, unconscious "Whoa, mare," as it bobbed silently under his touch. Occasionally, as he swayed heavily past it in his clumsy dress, the slight swirl of the water in his wake would make the horse slew round uncannily towards him, and thereafter it would swing and oscillate for a brief time, slowly back into quietness. The while that Grandfer would stand and watch it, unconsciously straining his ears in that place of no sound. 2 months passed in this way, and Granfer was vaguely aware that his health was failing, but the knowledge brought no fear to him, only the beginnings of an indefinite contentment, a feeling that maybe he would be soon seeing Nebby. Yet the thought was never definitely conscious, nor ever, of course, in any form phrased. Yet it had its effect in the vague contentment which I have hinted at, which brought a new sense of ease round Granfer's heart, so that one day, as he worked, he found himself crooning unconsciously the old ballad of the Seahorses. He stopped on the instant, all an ache with memory, and turned and peered towards the seahorse, which loomed a vague shadow, silent in the still water. It had seemed to him in that moment that he had heard a subtle echo of his crooned song in the quiet deeps around him. Yet he saw nothing, and presently assured himself that he heard nothing, and so came round again upon his work. A number of times in the early part of that day, old Granfer caught himself crooning the old ballad, and each time he shut his lips fiercely on the sound because of the ache of memory that the old song bred in him. But presently all was forgotten in an intense listening, for abruptly old Zacky was sure that he heard the song, coming from somewhere out of the eternal twilight of the waters. He slewed himself round, trembling, and stared towards the seahorse. But there was nothing new to be seen. Neither was he any more sure that he had ever heard anything. Several times this happened, and on each occasion Granfer would heave himself round ponderously in the water and listen with an intensity that had in it presently something of desperation. In the late afternoon of that day, Granfer again heard something, but refused now to credit his hearing, and continued grimly at work. And then, suddenly, there was no longer any room for doubt. A shrill, sweet child's voice was singing, somewhere among the grey twilights far to his back. He heard it with astounding clearness, helmet and surrounding water notwithstanding. It was a sound, indeed, that he would have heard through all the mountains of eternity. He stared round, shaking violently. The sound appeared to come from the greyness that dwelt away beyond a little wood of submarine growths that trailed up their roots, so hushed and noiseless, out of a nearby vale in the sea bottom. As Granfer stared, everything about him darkened into a wonderful and rather dreadful blackness. This passed, and he was able to see again, but somehow, as it might be said, newly. The shrill, sweet, childish singing had ceased, but there was something beside the seahorse, a little agile figure that caused the seahorse to bob and bound at its moorings, and suddenly the little figure was astride the seahorse, and the horse was free, and 2 twinkling legs urged it across the sea bottom towards Granfer. Granfer thought that he stood up and ran to meet the boy, but Nebby dodged him, the seahorse curvetting magnificently, and immediately Nebby began to gallop round and round Granfer, singing.
And we under the sea by where the waters go. Horses with tails as big as old whales are jigging around in a row. And when you says war, them devils does go.
The voice of the blue-eyed mite was ineffably gleeful, and abruptly tremendous youth invaded Granfer, and a glee beyond all understanding. Part 7. On the deck of the barge, Ned and Binny were in great doubt and trouble. The weather had been growing heavy and threatening during all the late afternoon, and now it was culminating in a tremendous black squall which was coming swiftly down upon them. Time after time, Binny had attempted to signal Grandfer Zacky to come up, but Grandfer had taken a turn with his lifeline round a hump of rock that protruded out of the sea bottom, so that Binny was powerless to do aught, for there was no second set of diving gear aboard. All that the two men could do was to wait in deep anxiety, keeping the pump going steadily and standing by for the signal. That was never to come. For by that time, old Grandfer Zacky was sitting very quiet and huddled against the rock round which he had hitched his line to prevent Binny from signalling him, as Binny had become prone to do when Grandfer stayed below out of all reason and wisdom. And all the time Ned kept the unneeded pump going, and far down in the grey depth the air came out in a continual series of bubbles around the big copper helmet. But Grandfer was breathing an air of celestial sweetness, all unwanting and unneeding of the air that Ned laboured faithfully to send to him. The squall came down in a fierce haze of rain and foam, and the ungainly old craft swung round, jibbing heavily at her kedge rope, which gave out a little twanging sound that was lost in the roar of the wind. The unheard twanging of the rope ended suddenly in a dull thud as it parted, and the bluff old barge fell off broadside onto the weight of the squall. She drifted with astonishing rapidity, and the lifeline and the air pipe flew out with a buzz of the unwinding drums, and parted with two differently toned reports that were plain in an instant's lull in the roaring of the squall. Binny had run forward to the bows to try to get over another kedge, but now he came racing aft again, shouting. Ned still pumped on mechanically, with a look of dull, stunned horror in his eyes, the pump driving a useless jet of air through the broken remnant of the air pipe. Already the barge was 1/4 of a mile to leeward of the diving ground, and the men could do no more than hoist the foresail and try to head her in safely over the bar, which was now right under their lee. Down in the sea, old Grandfer Zacky had altered his position. The jerk upon the air pipe had done that. But Grandfer was well enough content, not only for the moment, but for eternity. For as Nebby rode so gleefully round and round him, there had come a change in all things. There were strange and subtle lights in all the grey twilights of the deep, that seemed to lead away and away into stupendous and infinitely beautiful distances.
Is you listening, Grandfer?
Old Zacky heard Nebby say, and discovered suddenly that Nebby was insisting that he should race him across the strangely glorified twilights that bounded them now eternally.
"Sure, boy,"
said Grandfer Zacky undismayed, and Nebby wheeled his charger.
Gee up!
Shouted Nebby excitedly, and his small legs began to twinkle ahead in magnificent fashion, with Grandfer running a cheerful and deliberate second. And so passed Grandfer Zacky and Nebby into the land where little boys may ride seahorses forever, and where parting becomes one of the lost sorrows. And Nebby led the way at a splendid gallop, maybe, for all that I have any right to know, to the very throne of the Almighty, singing shrill and sweet.
Henry's under the sea, by where the wild horses go. Horses with tails as big as old whales are jigging around in a row. And when you says whoa, them devils does go.
And overhead, was it only 12 fathoms? There rushed the white-maned horses of the sea, mad with the glory of the storm, and tossing ruthless from crest to crest, a wooden go-horse, from which trailed a length of broken spunion.